Hey everyone, thank you so much for clicking on this video. I'm going to be talking about my experience in YWAM and the lasting effects of it, and I'm also going to be sharing some other people's stories from that time or before as well. I want to make it very clear that I'm not coming to this discussion speaking as a bitter and angry person. I have left my church and the religion that I was in for many, many years, but I'm coming from a place of repentance of the things that we did in that time, and also of deep, deep longing for change in that system. I also just really wanted to make this for people who are considering doing missions work or considering going back to missions work, specifically within YWAM. So I hope that this gets out to the right people. I also just think it's a very crucial time to be talking about missions work, specifically while the Black Lives Matter movement is coming to a head and gaining traction. And I think it is so important specifically for white people to be talking about this, because it is literally our jobs to dismantle the systems that have been put in place by us. So although I have left my church, I really hope that if you are still affiliated with religion or churches, you won't discount my testimony, because there are things that you need to hear in these testimonies. I'd also like to say that I really did not want to be the spokesperson for this, but I've gained a lot of courage from hearing other people's stories, and I feel like as soon as I decided to put my name to it, stories just kind of came flooding in. So it's important, and I want this story to be heard. I want these stories to be heard. I would also just ask, if you're logging on, please watch this all the way to the end. There are lots of topics that I'm going to be covering, and it's important that you hear them all. If you're not in a place to hear kind of a longer form video, I would suggest pausing this and taking a break and coming back to it when you can watch the whole thing. Also, at the end of this video, I'm going to be sharing a bunch of different links and resources for you or others to see, so stick around for that. So to the legalities of this section, I am not saying that YWAM is a cult. I'm only presenting the info that I have. I can only speak from my own experiences and the experiences given to me, though I know many others have had parallels and similar stories. Also, there will be a few clips of me reading either from my personal class notebook from that time period, or first-person accounts with either their names or anonymous on screen. And any names that I list, I have been given explicit permission to use their names. So, with all that being said, hi, my name is Shalom. In the summer of 2016, I was 17 years old. I attended a 6-month discipleship training school, also known as DTS, in Tyler, Texas. And that was on the base, which is the large ranch where we stayed in Texas, Tyler, Texas. And that base is associated with YWAM, which is Youth with a Mission. So DTS is about 4 months of training and about 2 months of what they call active missions. YWAM has this incredible ability to seek out impressionable, young, fresh from high school kids who are usually pretty traumatized from things that are going on in their lives. And the kicker is that they're all willing to invest their college savings. I spent my entire college fund that my parents had given me, plus what I received from fundraising, and in that 6-month period, I spent about $8,000. I know for a fact that YWAM Tyler is millions in debt, because in their words, they had one person abusing finances. How could they not know where their money was going? They also raised our monthly staff fees because of a staff conference trip, but it was right after they admitted to being in debt, and I'm sure that correlates. One of the main allures of me wanting to go to this training school is that they told us that we would get college credits after we completed it. And what wasn't communicated to me or any of us is that until after we graduated, is that the credits would only apply to a tiny private Christian school that was already in Tyler. I specifically was really emotionally vulnerable when I came to Tyler. My entire part of my family had moved to Australia, and so I was dealing with the grief and loss that I was feeling then. I was kind of dealing with abandonment issues and struggling with other areas, and what's mirrored in a lot of these testimonies is that people were coming from very hard places in their lives, and YWAM Tyler and their staff definitely abused and took advantage of that emotional turmoil in a lot of us. So I'm going to read a testimony from a woman named Elise. I'm going to read her testimony in its entirety just because I feel like it would be too confusing if I broke it up. Through my teenage years and young adult years in America, coming from a missionary kid's life, I experienced a lot of hardships. I found myself in a very dark place and was strongly contemplating suicide. I felt called to develop my relationship with God, and I thought, what better way than throwing myself into 6 months of nothing but God? So with my parents' blessing, I applied to attend a DTS at YWAM Tyler. As I finished up college before my DTS, I met a guy, we started dating, and 1 week before I was going to leave, we found out I was pregnant. We went back and forth on how to handle the situation, but ultimately I decided to attend. The first week was fine, but my morning sickness had set in, and I had to frequently leave the classroom to throw up. I knew I couldn't hide my current state for long, so I told my sister, who had completed her DTS at the same location and was very familiar with the staff, and she agreed to be there with me while I told the director of our class. At first, the director seemed to be pretty understanding, but she had a few ridiculous rules put in place, such as requiring me to tell my parents and classmates about my pregnancy, and forbidding me to be alone with my boyfriend when he came to visit me on campus. She also tried to make the rule that the father of my child couldn't attend my sonogram appointments, and this is the only requirement I pushed back on. She modified it so that he was allowed to attend, but only if someone else was in the room with us, which meant that someone outside of our relationship would be sitting in the room while I was physically exposed and being asked a lot of personal questions. My assigned job on the campus was to clean the girls' dorm, but the cleaning supplies that were provided to us had bleach in it, which I had been informed was something that I should not be exposed to while pregnant. I asked my dorm leader for permission to swap jobs with someone else on campus and explained to her that I didn't want to be exposed to harsh chemicals, but I was willing to do any other chore no matter how difficult. She ignored my request, saying that her sister had used bleach while she was pregnant, so she was sure it was okay. This blatant disregard for my child's health was another big sign that something was wrong with the organization. During my 3rd week, I decided to share with my class that I was pregnant. Standing in front of them all, I told them that I knew what I had done was wrong and that I was very ashamed, but that my heart was there to grow closer to God, and I hoped that they could accept me even knowing the state I was in. After I finished my speech, almost every student came up and hugged me. They were so accepting, loving, and understanding of my position. Not one sour word was spoken, nor one harsh glance came my way, until the guest speaker decided to step in front of the class. She shamed my classmates for being so forgiving of my sin. She said that God wants us to be held accountable, and that means that they need to really think about what I had done to arrive where I was and dwell on that. She used me as an example of how not to live, saying that I was broken and full of sin. I sat there totally ashamed and mortified, and it took every ounce of my strength not to break down crying in front of the class. I just poured out my heart and soul, and this woman of God decided to use me as an example of what filth looked like. She didn't care about the fact that my heart was in the right place. The only thing she cared about was the past. Another week passed. I was given permission by the director to run an errand off campus at my old apartment over the weekend. When I returned the following Monday, the director pulled me aside and began to question why I had left the base without her permission. I was frustrated by this point, but was kind with my delivery while explaining that she had given me permission a few days prior to me leaving. She denied any such agreement, gaslit me, and proceeded to ask if I felt that I was being manipulative, to which I stuck up for myself and responded, "If anyone is being manipulative, it is you, because you're lying about our conversation." She dismissed this and told me to take some time to cool off and that I really needed to evaluate where my heart was. I exploded into tears and stormed out of the room. I ran into my sister's boyfriend at the time, who was on staff, and he persuaded me into an off-campus lunch to talk. He tried his best to get me to stay, and even said on multiple occasions that the director was, in fact, a very manipulative person, but that I had to look past that and see the good that she does. After returning to the base, I began to pack my things and called my parents to let them know I was coming home, only to find out that the director had already called them and told them some twisted version of what had happened. I left the same afternoon. So, let's just kind of process that. Sit with that story for a minute. I asked Elise if she could send me sort of a little blurb about where she ended up after that, because I felt that her story would draw out the compassionate side of a lot of people's hearts. So here's her update. After leaving YWAM, my boyfriend proposed to me and we got married shortly after. I gave birth to our beautiful son the following year, and now we are coming up on our 3rd wedding anniversary. God has blessed me in so many ways, and he used both my marriage and motherhood to develop the deepest relationship I've ever had with him in my life. Here's another testimony. YWAM was such a positive change in my life in the sense that I really needed structure while I was in that season. However, with that structure came manipulation. I wasn't thinking as an individual. I would have done everything they'd asked me to do. I was coming out of an addictive lifestyle, and it was like they were using that to groom me to be dependent on them. I was looking for a new life, and at the time I felt like it was being handed to me. And another, just because there are good-hearted people in an organization does not mean that the environment isn't toxic. Often good-hearted people are preyed upon and drawn in because they are easy to manipulate, guilt-trip, and use for whatever purposes leaders in the organization have planned. So the base was set up much like a college dorm, except it was huge. I mean, we had a gym, we had a daycare, we had girls and boys dorms, we had whole little neighborhoods where the staff lived. So this place is massive. Our days were very structured. We would get up around 7, we would all go eat together for breakfast, and then we would pretty much head straight to class. We would have class for about 4 or 5 hours. We would leave class, go kind of our separate ways, but always in groups. We would talk about what happened in class. We would do our homework. Our classes were all structured around spirituality and, training us for the missions field. We also had chores in the afternoon. All of us had assigned things that we needed to do. Mine was helping clean the ginormous eating area. So that often took 1 hour to 2 hours a day. In the evenings, we would have Bible studies or devotions, and then we would go to bed. There were about 4 girls to a room, and I would assume 4 boys to a room as well. So we were completely saturated in time with each other, and also we pretty much never left the base. So from the time we got up at 7 a.m. to bedtime around 9 or 10, we were completely encapsulated in this little world. There are also no doors in the girls' room. I don't remember it being that weird because I was like, it's just kind of one of those college things, those college experiences. But now that I look back, I was definitely weirded out by that. We'd have to change with just little curtains. So it's a little bit shady. Something else about the staff at YWAM is that a lot of them who were right above us had only done about a year's worth of training. From what I understand, most of them do not get psych training or college professional training. It's just within the confines of Youth with a Mission. That being said, as students, we would go to them with every little question or concern that we had, and most of them, in my opinion and others' opinions, were not qualified to be helping us with these things. The way that they looked at spirituality was extremely damaging. For me, it always felt like it was my fault for not being spiritual enough, and when I came to them with questions, it would always be reflected back at me of like, hey, well, you really need to ask the Holy Spirit about this, or like, actually, did you really think this through before coming to talk to me? So it was definitely just complete spiritual shame. One of my fellow classmates, an international student with a kind, loving, and passionate heart, had completed 2 YWAM schools and felt completely confident that God was calling her back to her home country to work. Her school leader, however, sat her down to say that she highly doubted God would have her go through 2 schools just to go back to working in her home country. She was probably supposed to stay in YWAM. Of course, the leaders were the ones who were supposed to know what God was really saying about the students. We'd been fed the lie that the teachers were somehow more connected to God and therefore more knowing of His will for our futures than we were ourselves. I remember watching the student bawling her eyes out back at the dorm because the teacher's suggestion, in actuality a move of manipulation, made her question the total peace and confidence of where God was really leading her. Thank goodness she had the strength to understand her true calling, and she left YWAM to return to her home country. When I came back from my world travels, I had felt such peace about the next place God was leading me, but when I confided in one of my leaders, they advised me to visualize your next steps on a whiteboard, and then visualize yourself wiping it all away, because God told me that's not right for you. That pattern was repeated often. The staff would encourage us for months to listen to God, but as soon as we got a sign from Him, the staff would turn it around and advise against it. Another thing more specifically about the teachings in YWAM, so we did about 4 months of listening to different guest speakers and teachers come in and talk to our class. Each of these teachers had about a week to teach, and they rotated every week. More specifically about their teachings, there was always a dark and a light side to everything. They spoke in very black and white terms. Things that we did were either completely right or completely wrong. The devil was constantly out to get us, and it was our job to be able to listen to God and pray it away. Here are just a couple of notes that I wrote from our week on talking about spirituality and darkness. Push back darkness, pray down light. We are arrogant if we think we can argue unsaved people to the truth. Spiritual warfare is always a factor when presenting the truth. Supernatural darkness can only be pierced by supernatural light. So basically, everything that we did was either vilified or completely right, and it was up to us to listen to God to change that. However, when one of us felt like we were doing the right thing, it was usually vilified by the staff there. We were also taught to vilify people that did not have the same beliefs as us. We had a whole class on breaking down other religions, what they believed, and then vilifying every aspect of that, comparing it to our religion where everything was beautiful and good and right, and how to mold somebody's mind to our way of thinking. YWAM and its staff also heavily demonized mental illness, specifically depression. There were days that I physically could not get out of bed from being so depressed. I wasn't on medication back then, so I was very chemically imbalanced, and it was always my fault for not spiritually overcoming it. There was not a day of class that I missed because they would always tell this story about students in years gone by that even if they were throwing up from the flu and had a fever, they would bring their sleeping bags into the back of their class and listen and go throw up in the bathroom in between times. So, as you can see, the push to stay in class was intense, and there was no such thing as mental health days. Mental health was God, and if you had a crappy mental health day, that was the devil getting after you and getting in your head. There were many anti-education teachings and rhetoric during DTS. The leaders would actively discourage students who wanted to go to college after their DTS, stating how easy it is to fall back into the world in a college environment. They always push missions over education, even though an education can help you serve people in a more practical and effective way. This was backed by their slogan, "God doesn't call the equipped, he equips those he calls," which is just such dangerous ideology and such a dangerous thing to tell kids who are, most of us were 17 or 18, didn't know anything about manual labor, physical labor, the effects that we were damaging the countries and the people that we were supposedly trying to help. Toxic Charity is a great book. I read that after YWAM, and pretty much everything that YWAM does lines up with Toxic Charity. There's also a young man in our class, I'm going to keep him anonymous, but he had pretty severe mental health issues. He had schizophrenia, and he struggled to keep on his medication, and the YWAM leaders pushed for his spiritual awakening rather than getting him psychological help and evaluation. They were going to let this man, who was clearly very mentally ill, go overseas and hold people's babies. And this is not me vilifying schizophrenia or mental illness, but I'm saying that that man did not receive the help that he needed, and the staff clearly was not going to get him that help, and he eventually left because I think that he knew this wasn't the place for him, and he needed help, and he wasn't getting it from the people that were there that were supposed to protect him and help him. YWAM also had very charismatic teachings, which if you don't know what that means, charismatic is much more dramatized. We were often encouraged to speak in tongues during worship. It was also not biblical because technically in the Bible you're supposed to have a translator if you're speaking in tongues, and we didn't have that. There were extremely sexist and very heavy purity culture-based teachings. I really hope I don't have to explain why that's bad, but it was extremely pushed upon us at the time and really messed me personally up for a while. They also hammered in the idea that the only good relationship is within a heterosexual marriage. Here is a note from our class on marriage. The current divorce rate in the US is 50%. Of couples who worship together each Sunday, divorce rate is 3%. And of those who pray together, it's 0.3%. That's actually not factual, but none of us thought to fact check because they were leaders and they were smarter than us. Here's some notes on just definitions, or what definitions we were given of certain words. Sensuality, planned appeal to the physical sense for selfish gratification. Adultery, inability to relate properly to our neighbors. We don't love them, we just want to fulfill our desires with them. Lasciviousness, stirring up within us or another person desires that cannot be righteously satisfied. Homosexuality, an inability to relate properly to the same sex, directing sexual desire towards same sex. God doesn't hate homosexuals, he hates homosexuality. Ain't that a good old Christian term? God designed the family to have a mom and a dad. Kids need one of each. Transgenderism is a cruel lie. It's humans trying to control the ultimate design that God made. They're trying to choose their own identity. So, as you can see, lots of homophobia and very fundamentalist ideals about what a marriage should look like. They were also weirdly obsessed with porn and masturbation. We had like a whole class taught on it, how wrong it was, how terrible it is. Regardless of your thoughts on those issues, it shouldn't have been the focus of anything. Personally, I don't think it should have been brought up more than once, but we had a whole class on it. Pornography dramatically decreases ability to relate and love. Sex drive becomes less humanized. Again, not factual, and I have no fact-checking or way to fact-check that. Frequent pornography users are less likely to marry, and pornography equals narcissism. Also, this doesn't really relate to anything, but I would love to read this note for you. The real reason the Titanic sank, humans shaking their fists at God, saying not even God could sink this boat. So, there you go, folks. That's the real reason the Titanic sank, is because of sin. You heard it here first. Here are a few notes from our class on how to mold people's minds from different religions into our one perfect religion. Christ purchased humans from every tribe, language, and people. God is international and intimately involved in reaching all peoples, including islands and coastlands, inlands, and unreached peoples. 29% of the world has no access at all to Christianity. Majority of the unreached are Buddhist, Hindu, and Muslim. So there was an intense vilification of people who were not completely aligning with our beliefs. The interesting thing, too, is that they would give us a long list of, hey, here's Hinduism, Buddhism, Mormonism, Catholicism, here are all these religions, and they're so fear-based and scary, and they really just hammer into these non-believers about fear. And Christianity, what we believe, is so good and pure, and it's not fear-based, it's respect-based. But really, if you think about it, everything that we did was out of fear, because they were teaching us this black and white spirituality of everything is totally good or totally bad, no in between. Now we're going to get into Plumb Line Week. A plumb line is, I don't even remember the technical definition, but it's this thing that you hold on a line, and it's this little diamond-y shaped guy, and it's supposed to go around in a circle, and it aligns with your true self or something like that. So this was just a metaphor, and they called this Plumb Line Week. Essentially, what it was is all of us were packed into the classroom pretty late at night, which I think was kind of another tactic that they used, that we were all kind of tired and caught off guard. I remember the lights kind of being low and setting the mood, and music in the background. We were then required to sit in groups of 5 or 6, and we were told that whatever we shared in the circle, we would be cleansed of. It was made very clear to us that we would not be able to continue on to our missions work, which was happening the next week, if we didn't get cleansed of all of these sins. I cannot describe to you the fear that I felt in my heart of sitting in a room and having to spill my darkest secrets to my classmates and to my staff leaders whom I loved and looked up to so much. I know that this sounds very conspiratorial of me, but I've talked to some other classmates who have since left, and they agree with me that staff members may have been recording us and keeping the things that we said as blackmail. That's just kind of another example of the forced trauma bonding that went on there. I remember feeling so much closer to all of my classmates after that, because we had just spilled all of our trauma out to each other. So it was the easiest and quickest way to make fast friendships, which it worked. Plumb Line was the grand pillar of discipleship training school. To be truly forgiven and freed of past transgressions, one must openly confess every sin to a group of students and one leader. When it came to confessions, the more vulnerable the better. It seemed like a necessary evil, so I willingly provided my group with incriminating details. The whole night was full of spectacles, an influx of emotions never felt before rushed in. I was vulnerable, raw, merely unable to collect my own thoughts. The leaders were trained to gather our broken souls and place them into the plaster mold. Plumb Line sent me over the wall. I put myself to rest in order to become the YWAM missionary. It was the will of God. No other option was present. I drank the Kool-Aid with pleasure, believing it was the only way. In this setting, it was wrong to not tell the YWAM leaders every detail of your life, whether it was extremely personal, or you were introverted, or you were simply uncomfortable with sharing your life with people you don't know well. You were expected to tell your deepest secrets to your leaders and your small groups, and if you really wanted freedom from that secret, you should tell the entire classroom. If you did not tell the leaders everything, you were told you were being deceitful and doing something wrong. They would say, if it wasn't wrong, you would have told us. This allowed them to have more power over the students in many instances, including situations where they didn't like something they were doing. They could simply say, should you really be doing this when you've told me you're struggling with this? We're just trying to help you stay accountable. Also, once a week, we had something called Intercession, where we would break up into small groups. We would sit at a table for an hour, and we would intercede for whatever God wanted to tell us that day. We were told that interceding was God, us, and someone or something else. So we were like the middlemen. And we truly believe, because we were all so hyped up on this God complex, that we were going to change the world in intercession. And they would have us do practices like closing our eyes for half an hour and just writing down whatever came to mind. And then we would push all of our ideas into the middle and be like, oh, you got a circle. Oh, you got the idea of an airplane. Oh, you got this newspaper article. And we would make all the pieces fit and correlate and then think that we had predicted something. And then we would continue to pray for that situation. It's also not biblical to put God on a timeline or pack him into a short amount of time, because as they told us, God works outside of time. Another example of them packing God into a timeline, we were going to have the opportunity to choose where we were going for our overseas mission, and we were all assuming that we would get kind of this longer time to talk about it, think about it, pray about it, talk with each other about where we're all going. They had us all go into the classroom. They wrote China on one side of the board and Ecuador on another. They told us all to sit down, gave us scraps of paper, and said 5 minutes you need to turn in with your name and where you're going. I absolutely panicked because I hadn't thought about it at all. I didn't know anything about these two countries. I very quickly forced myself to close my eyes and think and pray. I wrote down China in a panic. That's the only place that sounded vaguely familiar to me. I turned it in. A week later, I realized that I had made the wrong choice because I felt a different calling, and I seriously had to plead my case to the director. I had to sit in her classroom. We had a whole meeting about it. She had to go and meet with other people to decide if they wanted to move me off, and thankfully they did move me to Ecuador, which is where I felt at the time that I was really being called to. But it was just this whole idea that they constantly kept putting God on a timeline and forcing us to make decisions in that timeline. I'm going to read some words from Stephen Bradford Long, who has a blog about some of his times in YWAM. Encased in an insular religious environment, every single tiny thing became laced with spiritual meaning. The world took on a hallucinogenic quality in which all emotions and experiences were heightened. It was a giddy experience, meaning infused everything. A tattoo, an earring, a gift from a friend, a breakfast, worship, a passage in the Bible. They all became omens of inexpressible import. And it wasn't just me who experienced this high, this incredible quality to life. It was all of us. Most of us felt that we had found a deeper reality, an intoxicating realm of meaning. I still find myself missing YWAM and aching for it, despite myself and despite all the skepticism I've accumulated over the years. I still have dreams in which I'm reunited with the organization. I will still astonish myself with a deep, aching yearn for such a sense of community, purpose, and spirituality. That really resonated with me because from all of the trauma and the PTSD and the self-loathing that I have and still have some aspects of that after doing DTS, I truly fell in love with the people and the culture there, and we were sheep for sure, but it was the old thing of ignorance is bliss, and we just having people all in a room working towards a common goal is really powerful, and I definitely got high and drunk off of that power. Students and staff are set up to be completely surrounded by the organization and people in it, deepening their emotional, mental, spiritual, and even physical ties with them, and making leaving much more difficult. Almost everyone lives on a ranch, surrounded by white gates. Most single women, even in their 30s, live in a dorm, same with the single men. Almost everyone attends the same church in Tyler each Sunday. All of your friends are in YWAM, and so are all of your mentors. Almost all of your finances are processed through the YWAM accounting department so that they know your financial situation. Because students and staff are so enveloped by one community, it is so hard for individuals to think logically and recognize the manipulation and mind control that is happening. I truly felt that I was going to stay at YWAM for the rest of my life. I thought I was going to be a missionary. I thought I was going to be encased in that compact little community for forever. I was so happy to be there. I became dependent on YWAM, completely dependent on them. Going home felt like being completely cut off. I did not choose to go back for the second round because as soon as I left that place and went back to my home, I realized how much pressure I felt being there to continue being there. After I went back home, almost all of my classmates cut me off because you don't have time for anybody else outside of the ranch because you are so completely and fully in it. And you don't have time to talk to people who are not in it with you anymore. So that hurt a lot, but I would not give it up for anything because that severance helped me realize where I needed to be. After my schools, when I decided to come back on staff, I was faced with the choice of which department I would work in, and ended up choosing a department that was uncommon for the younger staff to pick. I felt very passionate about my decision because I was going to be actively helping people every day. Not long after I had settled in, I started building a relationship with the head leader who had formed that department decades ago. The closer I became to the leader, the more the leader started saying that I was the person they had prayed for years. At first I felt honored and was in total awe that this incredible person of God thought I could truly help their department. Being a person who is very easily manipulated myself, though, as time went on, this growing expectation developed into an intense pressure I took on in a very unhealthy way. The leader continuously told me how vitally important I was for the future of the department. When I started seeing my life heading in a different direction, the leader began to constantly guilt-trip me by saying things like, "Oh, you're just going to leave us and go on to your new life." The guilt that was growing inside of me for possibly having another path in life outside of YWAM was becoming unbearable, to the point where I wanted to avoid the leader altogether. During an out-of-state trip I took with this particular leader and another longtime staff member, I was bombarded by daily relentless guilt-tripping. All day long, they both would cunningly, yet calmly attack me with accusations that I was planning on leaving them. On the second to last day, I was able to break away from their presence. I found a secluded place and proceeded to call my mom, sobbing, and told her how horrible I felt with their constant shaming and manipulation. Even though I could clearly see that they were manipulating me, it took me almost an entire year to gather the courage to actually leave that place. When I did, I felt the lift of a 1,000-pound weight off my shoulders. I've been in the U.S. military for 2 years now. The training goals within YWAM are not far from the Army. Obviously, YWAM leaders are not angry, explosive drill sergeants who take every chance to punish the trainee. They simply have different methods to achieve the same outcome. Total devotion to the prescribed system. This became evident during Plumb week. The leaders and instructors built this immense course designed to put our minds deep within the YWAM mold. Delusions of grandeur, that following God, their way, would ultimately transform your life for the better. I was labeled as rebellious for much of my time in YWAM for not conforming completely to their beliefs. When I was scouted for being a part of the leadership team, I knew I was being targeted for my past story, because it always looks better to have someone with a rebel heart who eventually falls into the ranks as submissive. Now we're going to get into the missions aspect of YWAM, DTS. I chose to go to Ecuador, along with about half of the original classmate group that I had. I realize that what I'm about to say is controversial, but I would like to push your boundaries a little bit and say that there is a very fine line between white saviorism and actually helpful charities and missions organizations. Some people say that there's no such thing as good charity and missions organizations. I'm not here to say if there is or isn't a good existing organization. I'm just here to say that YWAM isn't. I'm also not going to define white saviorism because it's kind of in the name and there's a ton of information that I will link below, and also online, do a quick Google search, it'll come up. I'm going to highlight just a few attributes. It completely robs the Native people of agency and dignity. It perpetuates colonialism, poverty porn, paints the people there as helpless and like they're relying on charity, when in reality they're extremely hardworking and can fend for themselves. There's a really good article by Ryan Kuja. It leads to paternalism, doing things to or for others rather than seeking to empower and build local capacity. It makes us into heroes rather than empowering others to become the heroes of their own stories. YWAM takes unskilled, untrained groups of mostly white, mostly teenagers to do what? Take some pictures, help build a few houses, lay some concrete, make them feel like their money was well spent. Even when we were there, I didn't feel like we were helping people. I felt like I was going into orphanages and holding their kids and making these traumatic ties with them that I eventually got to leave from, but the kids had to stay there and feel that pain of another person leaving. It is also so incredibly disrespectful to take pictures of other people's kids without their consent, regardless of whether or not they have parents to ask. We should not have been allowed to take pictures of kids and ship these pictures off back home on our newsletters, in our prayer letters to all of our families and supporters. It was so encouraged by our staff because that's how they got more revenue, is to say, hey, here's your kid with a little orphan, isn't she so sweet? Would you like to give your kid and us more money to go and do this again? If you think about it, would you let some random people come into your kid's school and take pictures with your kid and then put it on a newsletter? Probably not. Logical thinking says that's not okay, and it's extremely dehumanizing and disrespectful. When I look back on my time in Ecuador, one kid in particular comes to mind. We'll call him Andy. Andy came up to me and confessed to being homosexual. He explained he was torn in two halves, one side striving to be a Christian man who does anything to rebuke his forbidden desire, the other side longing for love and affection that could only be felt with his boyfriend. Andy asked me what the right thing to do was, as if my opinion was the ultimate factor. In the moment, I was unsure of right or wrong. Still, I followed the good book's orders and renounced his relationship with his boyfriend, then encouraged the young man to keep those passions suppressed. I told him God would reward him. Looking back, I offered Andy no real solution. Instead, I saw what I thought was the root of his issue and amplified his pain, sending him full speed into a righteous life. Sometimes I saved people, sometimes I damaged people, and sometimes I confused people. It makes me very emotional and angry to think about how we influenced the kids while we were there in Ecuador. We were moving pretty constantly to a new place each day or each week, and we preached the gospel to so many kids and helped them with a lot of different hard situations that we were not prepared for and that we were not given guidance on. Again, it was up to us to get guidance from God and from our staff members. I bonded very closely with one of the girls in Ecuador. For the story, I'm going to call her Elle. I was the only one that she would let me pick up. She would fall asleep in my arms every night. I bonded very deeply with her, and she bonded really deeply with me. We spent a whole week in each other's lives. We played together, we prayed together. I described it in my journal as my heart being ripped out when I had to leave her. I cannot imagine what this little girl must have felt to be abandoned by her parents, grow up being attached to various other missionaries and people that came in and out of her life, extreme attachment issues, only to have me be the one who walks away. I got to walk away, I got to write about it in my journal, and that was it. And she had to stay with that. The attachment that the kids had to us was not normal, was not healthy. They didn't have boundaries set in place to protect these kids. That was on YWAM for not looking into that more. So we returned back from Ecuador, and we had a whole week on unpacking what we learned and what we did there. And we also had training on how to assimilate back to normal life. We had to unlearn a lot of phrases that we use in YWAM. One of the phrases that you hear me say a lot is YWAM. We were told to only refer to YWAM as Youth with a Mission to other people who don't know what it is, because that way people knew what it was about. That is why I refused to say Youth with a Mission and pretty much exclusively refer to it as YWAM, because then people ask about it and I'm like, yeah, don't go there, it's kind of a scam. Upon my return to a normal society, no longer within their grasp, I experienced culture shock. My own home and lifestyle that had been lived for my whole life seemed brand new. I could not trust any church I visited. They seemed unrighteous, or at least not adequate. I viewed my own parents at one point as lukewarm Christians. I forgot how to trust almost immediately after my return. They really pumped us up with a God complex and a Savior complex, and then expected us to just go back home and live a normal life. And I remember being so incredibly pious when I went back to my family and thinking that I just knew better than everybody else. And there was something so broken inside of me when I left YWAM, because as soon as you get cut off from that community, it's like it's over. I didn't have plans to go back, and so I just felt so lost and alone. And I finally built myself up after many years of unlearning and deconstructing and educating myself, and I'm finally at a good place where I can say that I would never go back, but it was so incredibly traumatic to feel like you knew everything and then just completely get cut off from the source. I just have two anonymous impact statements to share with you. YWAM made me feel unworthy of God's love. On my DTS, I experienced significant control by subtle emotional coercion of my decisions and emotions, forcing me into a state of blind compliance. This left me with feelings of confusion, isolation, desperation, and ultimately losing touch with my emotional self and connection with others. I am open to critique and criticism for things that I've said in this video. I know I'm going to get some pushback from more conservative people that are my friends and family. What you're not going to do is flock to the comments or flock to my direct messages and say, well, it sucks that happened to you, but that's actually not my experience. That is so invalidating and so sucky, and just please don't do that. This is not the time or place for that. And, you know, if you want to say, like, people treated you badly, but that's not the heart of Jesus, if that statement is true, then you should be just as angry as we all are. To my YWAM classmates that I have not got in contact with, there's probably a reason for that. It's either you're still very involved with YWAM or you constantly asked me for money for your next missions trip after I had already left. So I wish you all the best. Genuinely, I hope that you can find peace and personal healing outside of that traumatic mess that we went through. Also to my LGBTQ plus watchers who might still be in a church or involved with religion, I really want you to know that you do not have to change to become a better person or to become closer to God. There's no such thing as black and white. It's only shades of gray. Don't change for your religion or for your church. If your church is telling you otherwise, please leave and find an affirming church. There are so many of them out there. To everyone else, thank you for watching and listening. I hope that you continue to question everything around you, look into it, do your own research. If you are someplace that doesn't encourage asking questions, GTFO. There will be links down below to a lot of different sources that kind of expand on the topics that I've talked about and touched on, and also here are some Instagram accounts that I have found very healing. One more thing. I know that this sounds very paranoid of me, but I would just like to say this. I am not suicidal. I don't plan on taking my own life. I know I could sound like a conspiracy nut, but I just wanted to get that on record. So, yeah. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Peace.